My name is Talia Chung, and I'm the University Librarian and Dean of Libraries here at the University of Ottawa. I'm delighted to be your Master of Ceremonies for this evening, dedicated to the power of women's voices in public life with the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. C'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir en présentiel et en virtuel dans le cadre de cet événement très spécial présenté par le projet sur l'histoire des femmes, en partenariat avec le Famous Fondation, Famous Ottawa, l'Institut canadien de recherche sur les femmes et l'Université d'Ottawa. Je vous rappelle que l'événement se déroulera en anglais, mais que vous pouvez poser vos questions en français si vous le souhaitez. I'd like to remind you that the event will take place in English. However, we welcome you to ask your questions in French, should that be more convenient for you. We are very pleased to welcome you in person and virtually to this special event presented by the Women's History Project in partnership with the Famous Foundation, Famous Ottawa, the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, and the University of Ottawa. As is our custom here at the University of Ottawa, whenever we gather together, as we are doing this evening, we offer our Indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land, and we acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations from across Canada who call Ottawa home. And we acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders past, present, and future. Avant de procéder, je vais répéter donc l'affirmation autochtone de l'Université d'Ottawa. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à toutes les personnes autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'elles soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiennes et gardiens des savoirs traditionnels de tous âges et nous honorons aussi leurs dirigeantes et dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain, au courage indéniable. Now, I would like to invite Deborah Davis, President and co-founder of the Women's History Project, to say a few words. Please, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Talia. What a crowd. This is really, really nice to see. Welcome to the Women's Histories Project first in-person event. As a new organization, we started in April 2022. We've hosted 5 very successful online events, and now we're turning an exciting new page. I love history. I just wasn't very good at it at high school. I studied Canadian history, American history, British history, and as many people do, and they were about battles and generals and exploration and acts and dates that simply disagreed with me. Women were either queens or witches, and women's studies courses were in the distant future. Popular media, however, historical novels and films, how inaccurate as they are, tell stories. And they inspired me to look at real life characters in the context, they inspired me to look up the real life characters, the context and the facts, much easier now in a Google world and online Canadian encyclopedia. When I was chatting with a high school friend and we were trying to catch up after 50 years, I was trying to describe my work trajectory, my work at the Status of Women Canada, the places I had been, the people I had met, the women I had worked with. And then I realized a lot of my former colleagues and friends were very much part of that second wave of the feminist movement, or they were long-time feminist activists. And that became the genesis of the Women's History Project. The voices of the 1970s and the early 80s are now fading or are silent. And certainly the women who championed the right to vote or to be appointed to the Senate are long gone. Hence the importance of documenting history through the work such as the Women's Archives initiatives at the University of Ottawa's library. The Women's Histories Project's ambition is to tell stories of those champions and trailblazers, to tell the stories about women in the labor movement, in the media, lawyers who advocated for better divorce laws, and women who started the women's shelters movement, for instance. Our goal is to turn young people on to the contribution of women in a way that resonates with young people. History by sizzle reels, look up sizzle reels, and short docs involving young people in researching and telling those stories, working with teachers and academics. Video podcasts featuring those women who were there or who are experts in the field. To get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaigns. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the local, provincial, and national levels who have used their voice to make a difference. Women who put their name on the ballot. And interestingly, the women who ran those campaigns. So the women in the back room are as important as the women who put their names on the ballot. And there are many people here tonight who did that. Tonight, we are welcoming the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. It was 30 years ago this spring that Ms. Campbell was elected leader on the second ballot, defeating Jean Charest to become Prime Minister. She had used her voice. She had used her voice before that historic day and has continued since. And we are thrilled that Ms. Campbell agreed to be part of our mission. Before we move on, I'd like to take a few moments to thank our partners. This event would not be possible without collaboration. Women's groups are never well funded, but we do make it work creatively and with grit. Thank you to the University of Ottawa. This is the first part of our partnership. We know there will be more to follow. Thank you to Talia, her team, and President Jacques Frémont. Thank you to Frances Wright and the Famous Five Foundation, who keeps the stories of Emily, Henrietta, Nellie, Louise, and Irene alive, and who host monthly Pink Teas, showcasing the women today who are making a difference. Also to Famous Five Ottawa, many members are here tonight, who celebrate nation builders, coordinates a lunch and learn series, a mentorship program, and helps fill a room. Thank you, Beatrice. And to the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, who manages our charitable receipts and donations in these early days. I would like to thank also the Honourable Vivienne Poy and the University of Ottawa for their financial contributions. I'd also like to pay respect to the Honourable Monique Bégin, who was not only my inspiration, she was an incredibly generous person, and her early contributions helped us set up the Women's History Project. I'd also like to thank Nancy Ruth, who believed in us. Nancy's very own foundation makes the Women's History Project possible. We are a volunteer board, and I'd like to thank my sister board members who have brought joy, ideas, and wisdom to our endeavors. Thank you. Lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us to celebrate the Women's History Project, the Women's History Month, Persons Day, and the Right Honourable Kim Campbell.
Merci beaucoup, Deborah. J'aimerais à présent céder la parole au recteur et vice-chancelier de l'Université d'Ottawa, M. Jacques Frémont. Please welcome President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Ottawa, Jacques Frémont.
Wow, what a crowd. Madame Kim Campbell, Madame la Première ministre, Mesdames et Messieurs les doyens, membres du corps professoral, étudiantes et étudiants, chers diplômés, merci d'être avec nous ce soir. C'est très important. Je souhaite à toutes et à tous une très, très bonne journée de, ça dit l'affaire personne. When I was younger, I happened to teach constitutional law, and it was in 1929 that women in Canadian law were considered as persons. But it was not by a Canadian court. I want to remind you, it was the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council who did that. So it was an imperialist, by an imperialist ruling that at last women were considered persons in Canadian law. So it is disturbing somehow. Mais cette déclaration a ouvert la porte à une participation accrue des femmes à la vie publique et politique. But participating was one thing. It took still more than 6 decades for a woman to lead Canada. When the Right Honourable Kim Campbell became the first and so far the only Canadian Prime Minister woman to serve as Prime Minister of Canada. Thank you, Mrs. Campbell, for having done that. Thank you for still being the model. And please, 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 let's have women Prime Minister in this country soon. Next week will mark 30 years since Mrs. Campbell moved on to active politics. As you may know, she remains a fierce advocate of women's rights, honoring the legacy of the Famous Five and other feminists around the world. She has earned a truly impressive list of posts and honors, both in Canada and around the world. Sa conférence aujourd'hui, et je vais ajouter ma voix à celle de ma prédécesseure, arrive à point nommé pour notre communauté universitaire, qui est encore ébranlée par le décès récent de l'honorable Monique Bégin, une autre grande militante pour les droits de la personne, et qui a été la première doyenne de la Faculté des sciences de la santé à l'Université d'Ottawa et une amie de longue date de notre établissement. Elle a laissé sa marque non seulement dans le monde politique, mais aussi dans le monde universitaire, et ça jusqu'à la fin. Nous lui devons beaucoup. Le 2 novembre prochain, une cérémonie à la mémoire de Mme Bégin aura lieu ici à l'université, et c'est un honneur pour nous d'organiser cet événement. When it comes to addressing gender in public life, the University of Ottawa, with its proximity to the federal government and its scholarship on women issues, is proud to host discussions such as this one as a way to showcase women's history. In fact, our library houses one of the most important collections on second wave feminist material in Canada, documents which enable us to preserve a wealth of women's stories and share them with future generations. And I think actual generations and future generations have to learn from the fights of the past and from the heroes of the past. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight to hear the experiences and the wisdom of our guests. Maintenant, nous allons accueillir dans quelques minutes, très chaleureusement, l'honorable Kim Campbell, une personne extraordinaire. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Recteur. On October 18th, we mark Persons Day, the historic moment, as our president just referred to, the historic moment when in 1929, the Judicial Committee of the British Privy Council confirmed that women were indeed persons. To hear more about the significance of this day and its impact on Canadian women in public life, please welcome Beatrice Keller-Rafoul, Chair of Famous Five, Ottawa. Beatrice, please.
Thank you, Talia, and good evening. And thank you very much, Ms. Campbell, for being here to celebrate this wonderful day with us. Merci d'être venu aujourd'hui pour célébrer la journée de la personne avec la très honorable Kim Campbell. Les célèbres 5, Emily Murphy, Nellie McClung, Henrietta Muir Edwards, Irene Parlby, and Louise McKinney de l'Alberta ont invoqué un droit peu connu qui permettait à 5 citoyens d'envoyer une requête à la Cour suprême pour obtenir une interprétation d'un point de droit. Trust women to do their homework and figure how to maneuver the system. Women were not deemed eligible to be appointed to the Senate, as they were not deemed qualified persons. Emily, on a fine summer's day on August 27, 1927, invited 4 of the brightest and most determined women activists she knew to her Edmonton home. On Emily's veranda, the Famous Five signed a letter petitioning the Supreme Court to look into the matter of whether the government could appoint a female senator. But as we know, it did not pass in Canada, and they went all the way to the Privy Council in London, who deemed that women were in fact persons and could be summoned to the Senate. None of these women were ever summoned, but Corinne Wilson was the first woman summoned a few years later. But who were these 5 women? They were all suffragettes. Emily Murphy became the first female magistrate in the British Empire. Before that, she championed the rights of wives to share ownership in their husband's property, giving them and their children security in case of abandonment. Her efforts helped create the Married Women's Protective Act, passed in Alberta in 1911. Louise McKinney was a lifelong organizer, a staunch supporter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and was elected as an independent to the Alberta legislature. This made her the first woman elected to sit as a member of any legislative assembly in the British Empire. Nellie McClung was a novelist, reformer, journalist, and suffragette. Feisty and charismatic, Nellie had a way of winning over opponents with her wit and humor, and boy did she need it in these circumstances. She led the fight to enfranchise North American women and to Manitoba becoming the first province to grant women the right to vote and run for office. After her move to Alberta, Nellie became a Liberal MLA for Edmonton, where she often worked with Irene Parlby, despite representing different political parties, on issues affecting women and children. Nellie was the first female director of the Board of Governors of CBC. In 1938, she was chosen as a delegate to the League of Nations in Geneva. The eldest of the famous five, Henrietta Muir Edwards, was an artist as well as a legal expert. Women and men alike often came to her for help with legal issues affecting women and children. She helped found the National Council of Women of Canada in 1893, an organization that continues to this day, that works to improve the quality of life for women, families, and society. She published Canada's first women's magazine and established the prototype for Canadian YWCA. She also helped found the Victorian Order of Nurses in 1897. Irene Parlby, an Englishwoman, became a Western Canadian farmer's wife and was a firm advocate for rural farm women of Alberta. She organized and became the first president of the United Farm Women's Association, was elected to the Alberta legislature as a member of the governing United Farmers of Alberta Party, and became the first female cabinet minister in Alberta and the second in the entire British Empire. Irene used her influence to champion the rights and welfare of women and their families. Alors, nous sommes ici à l'occasion du 94e anniversaire de l'affaire Personne. Next year will be our 95th, and we invite you to join with us in celebrating in different ways throughout the year. Please let me know if you want to join our group. The announcement was made today by Minister Marcy Ian of the 2023 Governor General's Person's Case Awards. Les récipiendaires sont Marlene Catterall d'Ottawa, Gemma Hickey, Nafisa Ismail, Lauren McDonald, Maria Wu, and Aditi Sivakuman. She is the youth prize winner for this award. We had hoped that Marlene Catterall was going to be here. I'm not sure that she made it. Marlene has had some health issues as of late, but she really wanted to be here, and I had spoken with her earlier, and she was going to do her utmost. So we congratulate her. She's been a strong supporter of the Famous Five in Ottawa, and she was one of the multi-caucus women that were assembled by Sheila Copps, who was then the Minister of Canadian Heritage, to ensure that the Women Are Persons monument was on Parliament Hill. And so we thank her, and we thank Marjorie Le Breton, who's here as well, for the work that she did in the Senate with her caucus and others, because it was it's it's always a struggle for women, but it was a good fight worth winning. And we even made it to the money, and we're continuing to do so with other well-known faces. So thank you very much for being here and for celebrating Persons Day with us in such a way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. And now the moment we're waiting for. To introduce tonight's featured women, please welcome international technology entrepreneur, former Prime Minister's office staffer, and board member for the Women's History Project, Giovanna Migarelli.
Thank you so much, Talia. And ladies and gentlemen, elected officials, distinguished guests, members of the media, and supporters of the Women's History Project. It's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce you to the highlight of this very special event, celebrating the remarkable contributions of women in Canada's history and the legacy of Persons Day. Today, we're delighted to have with us a true trailblazer and a champion of women's rights, Canada's former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. As we gather here today to commemorate Persons Day, a pivotal moment in Canada's history when women were legally recognized as persons under the law, it's only fitting that we are joined by a woman who has left an indelible mark on the country's political landscape. Kim Campbell, Canada's first and to date only woman Prime Minister, embodies the spirit of perseverance, leadership, and resilience that we celebrate today. Throughout her distinguished career, Ms. Campbell has shattered glass ceilings, inspiring countless women and girls to dream big and reach for the stars. Her unwavering commitment to public service, her dedication to advocating for gender equality, and her trailblazing journey in Canadian politics are an inspiration to us all. Ms. Campbell will be interviewed by my dear colleague, Ms. Komal Minhas, another women's rights activist and champion in her own right. Komal is a contributor for Fortune magazine and CTV News and is a founder of Carseva, a company focused on building individual, economic, and societal resilience through advisory, media production, and investing. She curates powerful experiences and conversations as an interviewer, business strategist, resilience educator, and investor, and was named to Oprah Winfrey's Super Soul 100 list for this work. She's awesome. As an interviewer, she has been in conversations with Michelle Obama, Glennon Doyle, Rupi Kaur, Angela Duckworth, and more. Komal is a board member of the Women's History Project. As we engage in this conversation about Ms. Campbell's insights and reflections on the progress that has been made and the work that remains to be done for women in Canadian history, let us draw inspiration from her remarkable journey and the countless stories of women who have made Canada a more inclusive and equitable nation. In this time of reflection and celebration, we're reminded of the indomitable spirit of Canadian women who have paved the way for future generations. So without further ado, let us extend a warm and very enthusiastic welcome to the incomparable, the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, and the extraordinary Komal Minhas. Thank you for joining us for this celebratory occasion.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put my little voice notes on. I find that it helps me to see how long I'm talking so that I won't go over my 10 minutes. And I also listen to it after to see if there's any signs of cognitive decline. I'm at that age. This evening, I'm going to speak to you fairly briefly and then engage in a conversation with Komal, which I think is kind of interesting. But I wanted to just open with a few comments because we've had a kind of a schizophrenic conversation where we've talked about the great advances women have made and the remarkable accomplishments of the famous five and the Persons case. But there's also a theme of what the struggles that we still face and the things that still are barriers for women. And when we talk about the importance of women's voices in government, the question is, yes, we have come so far, but why aren't there more? And so I wanted to talk very briefly about some of the barriers and things that we need to think about. And it's particularly important, I think, in the context of a university where the structure of teaching and knowledge is so important. Oh, il faut m'excuser, je n'ai pas fait l'introduction, Monsieur le Président, Madame la Présidente, tout le monde, les doyens, les étudiants, excusez-moi. Sorry. I'm out of practice, you can tell. Because what struck me is we're celebrating the person's case, women becoming persons. But we still have the struggle sometimes to appreciate and celebrate and guarantee a recognition of the full personhood of women. We are not just persons in a legal sense of being recognized, that we could be called to the Senate, but our entire whole personhood is very often ignored or disrespected when people think they have the right to make decisions about us, how we use our bodies, where we go. And so it is this notion of why this fully fledged personhood is still not always recognized that I want to just address very quickly. And to some degree, it's very much related to the narratives that we tell about women and about what it means to be female. There's been a surge of publications over the last couple of decades about women's achievement in many fields. There's a book by a woman called Kate Moss with an E, not the skinny model, but the novelist, called Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, which talks about 1,000 different women over a couple of millennia who have distinguished themselves and blazed the trail in literature and governance and science. There's all sorts of books. If you go on the website of the Perimeter Institute here, you will find a very interesting list of women scientists and mathematicians whose foundational contributions are still being used. But I think of one of them, and I forget her name, but a German woman who in the 19th century wanted to study mathematics, and her father said, no, that wasn't appropriate. But she had a neighbor who said to her father, well, why don't you let her study mathematics? And so she was allowed to study. She got a PhD with great difficulty. She could never get an academic position, but her research is still foundational in modern mathematics. And so when I was young and people used to say to me, well, Kim, you're smart, but where's the female Einstein? I had no answer. But you know, there are women who have made those kind of contributions. And if Albert Einstein himself were asked, he might actually say Emmy Noether, who sadly died at 40, but was certainly my equal in terms of her contributions to physics and research. So they are out there. Women have done these things. And you think about this woman, what if she didn't have a neighbor? And what about all the other women who were passionate to study mathematics and had no one to advocate for them, who never got the chance to learn? Or like so many women scientists wound up as working as lab assistants in their husbands' labs. You know, I've just finished a year and a half working on a global commission on climate overshoot. And this is when I was asked to serve, I said, what is overshoot and why does it need a commission? And you can go online to climateovershootcommission.org and find out the answer to that question. But you know, the first person who identified the greenhouse gas properties of carbon dioxide was a woman, Edith Foote. And she did empirical experiments and was able to show that carbon dioxide held heat in. But she was not allowed to read her paper at a scientific meeting. A man read it for her, and so nobody paid any attention. 2 decades later, a man published a similar paper, and he is credited with this discovery. So the point is, we have to change the narratives about women. We have to rediscover and re-articulate the existing accomplishments. We don't have to make it up. We don't have to pretend. We don't have to exaggerate. We don't have to enlarge it. We have to tell, because that's how people learn how the world works. That's how young boys and girls learn what contributions people like their mothers as well as their fathers have made to the world. So there's a growing interest in women composers and artists, but there's, you know, the Nobel Prizes were just announced, and there were women who received Nobel Prizes in physics and physiology and medicine. And Claudia Golden won the Nobel Prize in economics. Now, I knew Claudia Golden when I was at Harvard, and Claudia Golden wrote that wonderful study that I used to use all the time in my gender and power class about the way symphony orchestras audition to hire musicians. And that when symphony orchestras auditioned behind a screen so that the adjudicators couldn't see who was playing, they hired significantly more women. But what was interesting to explain that result was the interviews she did with conductors. And what she found was that conductors would say almost to a person, almost to a man, that women had small technique. Now, if you think you're going to hear small technique, you will hear small technique. We now know the importance of the implicit attitudes that we have, what we bring. And so many of the myths about women feed these kind of implicit attitudes that women have small technique, or that they may be smart, but there's no, really serious world-class scholar or composer. But there are. And so we have an obligation, if we want to increase the value of the personhood of women. And it's not just that every woman has to be outstanding. She doesn't. But the fact that as a sex, we produce extraordinary people and have made extraordinary contributions to world culture has to be part of our conversation. And so I remember years ago when somebody started a women's studies program at U.B.C, and an English professor who was named Dick Fredman, who was kind of a terrible sexist, said, well, I'm going to have men's studies. I said, but that's what you already have, But so there are so many different myths about sex differences that really make it hard often for women to be seen as the strengths that they are. When I became prime minister, nobody who looked or sounded like me had ever done that job before. And it was a big shock for some people, and particularly the Ottawa Press Gallery. But the more we do that, the more women are seen in these non-prototypical situations, the more we can reprogram people's expectations of who gets to do that job. The more the voice, the physiognomy, the manner is seen as natural to leadership. I'm a member of an organization of former presidents and prime ministers. And I remember when Angela Merkel was elected leader of the German Social Democratic Party. And I said to one of my colleagues, the German Social Democrats have just elected a woman leader. Germany could have a female chancellor. Oh, no, he said, no, if they win, she won't be the chancellor. And I said, well, how does that work? But of course, they did win and she became the chancellor. And by the time she left office, Angela Merkel as chancellor of Germany was like, oh, okay, it was normal. And so we have to create the normality of the full personhood of women, that we do everything. We aren't just one thing or another thing. And we don't also all have to leap tall buildings in a single bound to be entitled to the respect of that full personhood, that entire complex, multifaceted aspect of a human identity. And I want to just share with you one more thing that I saw recently, because much of these stereotypes also come from assumptions about women being the weaker sex. And we know that for many years, women weren't allowed to do things because it would, disrupt their reproductive systems and all these terrible things. And the first woman who wanted to run a marathon actually signed up with just using her initials, because it didn't say a woman couldn't run the marathon, but just to be on the safe side, she didn't put her name. And when the race organizer saw that she was a woman, he tried to actually physically force her off the track, because women could not be running these races. But now what we know is probably women are more equipped than men are to run these kind of races. Why? Well, I refer you to the most recent Scientific American. I'm not going to tell you the whole article now. I don't have time. But there's a very interesting article about the myth of man the hunter. We all believe that in evolutionary terms, in prehistoric people, that the men were the hunter and the women were the gatherers and they looked after the kids. Well, it turns out that serious research, and thank God for universities and serious researchers, that women, in fact, were very much hunters. And not only were they hunters, and they know this by not only their physical remains that we have of prehistoric creatures, but also the cultural things that were left with them. And it's amazing how many male scientists have deliberately overlooked data, you know, female skeletons found with hunting tools around them. Oh, maybe their hubbies threw it into the grave, you know, like, how did that happen? But what it turns out is that women, in fact, are physiologically, because of the role of estrogen on our bodies, are physically more equipped for endurance. Men, and incidentally, human beings have had estrogen for probably anywhere from 600 million to 1.6 billion years longer, estrogen receptors, and our predecessor species, than they've had testosterone receptors. So testosterone is relatively new, but estrogen has been there for a long time. And it is the hormone that creates endurance and strength. And women are absolutely astonishing in ultra endurance sports. Testosterone, which men have more of, is very good for what they call the short. I had a thing, the muscles that give you short, very strong, you know, like bench lifting, that kind of strength. But endurance is more for women. And I'm just going to. Somebody says it's time to bury the man, the hunter, for good. But what was interesting was that females are more regularly dominating the ultra endurance events, such as the 260-mile Montaigne Spine foot race through England and Scotland, the 21-mile swim across the English Channel, and the 4,300-mile Trans Am cycling race in the US. Women are dominating these events. Sometimes female athletes compete while attending to the needs of their children. In 2018, English runner Sophie Power ran the 105-mile Ultra Trail de Mont Blanc race in the Alps while still breastfeeding her 3-month-old at rest stations. So the point I'm making, and just in these brief comments, is that there is a growing body of literature which refutes many of the cultural stereotypes and the assumptions that people have made about what men and women are capable of. And the problem with those stereotypes is that they're dangerous, because they make assumptions that lead, for example, as women being described recently in Britain as the shock absorbers of poverty, that they're very often much less well served by their society. There was an article I saw recently about the need for a feminist approach to cancer treatment, because women are systematically more poorly diagnosed and treated about cancer, and that doctors tend to focus on the possibility of female cancers, breast and ovarian, while they die just as great numbers of lung and colorectal cancer. So and the dangers of populism. Rising populism is very, very bad for women. So if we want to increase the voices of women, we have to make sure that people know what a rich resource they are. We have to tell the stories of women throughout the eons, throughout the millennia that we know about, who have made remarkable contributions, not because they're better than men, but because, like men, they are fully fledged persons with remarkable characteristics, including the ability to run longer and stronger than some of their male counterparts. So I'm going to have a conversation now about some of the aspects of having women's voices in public life. But if I leave you with one idea from these remarks, it's that narratives matter. And we have to tell the narratives that are true and that tell the story of the full personhood of women. It's not enough to be legally persons. We have to be recognized for that full quality of the lives that we lead and that we offer to society. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. I am so excited to be here today and to be leading this conversation with the Right Honourable Kim Campbell. I was at Thanksgiving dinner a few weeks ago, and my grandmother-in-law, actually, I asked her at the table, I said, what question should we ask Kim Campbell? Because I like to crowdsource. Some of the conversations in advance of today are definitely leaking into the conversation. And I asked her, what question would you want to ask? And she said bluntly, no second to think. And she said, What was it like to have those guys in the back room throw her under the bus like that? Because it was devastating for us women when we saw it happen. And so I want us to start there, because this is a sentiment I've heard repeated by so many people when we talk about your narrative and the story of your prime minister experience. And so I want us to rewrite that and to hear it straight from you.
Well, there's an easy question to start with, and the room will now be divided. Well, to answer, and instantly, am I being heard? Is that good? Let me start by saying that most women I know don't like to think of themselves as victims. I chaired a plenary at a conference in Vancouver on Saturday with Martha Piper and Indira Samarasekera, who were the first women to be presidents, respectively, of U.B.C. and the University of Alberta. And they have written a wonderful book called Nerve, the stories of two women who went first. And they both said that although they know they encountered all sorts of discrimination and lots of pushback, and again, universities are, I mean, herding cats is, it's a slander on cats, actually, to describe it. Universities have been described as, collections, university faculties have been described as collections of independent contractors brought together by a shared grievance over parking. But, they are not easy to govern, but they did not want to think of themselves as victims. And when Nancy Hopkins at MIT did her research, when she discovered that her much younger assistant had a much bigger lab than she had, and she went around interviewing other women scientists and measuring labs, what she found was that other women were quite uncomfortable being seen as victims. When you're seen as a victim, it kind of erodes your sense of autonomy. So when I look at 1993, there may well have been people, swinging, the Campbell corpse under a bus. I don't know. I certainly knew that I was facing a difficult prospect because, first of all, we were practically at the end of the 5th year of our mandate, so there wasn't a lot of time to remake the government or even create my own campaign team. A bigger problem in hindsight than it even appeared at the time. But what I like to think about it, first of all, I have a bad memory. I don't remember the people who were awful to me. I really don't. Partly because I understand that in the context of political campaigning and rivalries, things, people express certain parts of themselves that may not be necessarily the most important parts of their character. But I don't hold grudges. Maybe I'm just too lazy or a bad memory, or I am getting demented. So what I think about is, there was a lot of difficulty, I had a lot of frustration that summer. And in particular, because I was so tired and we had so little time, I had to call an election. And every time I wanted to, get a bit of rest, people say, oh no, you've got to go here and you've got to go there. And, it wasn't so easy. But what I try to focus on instead was what I did when I was prime minister. And incidentally, talking about myths and stereotypes, how many of you here, this will be kind of a giveaway, but how many of you here assumed that I'm the shortest serving prime minister in Canada? You can put your hand up if you sort of thought that was probably the case. Yeah. Well, actually,
lies.
But actually, I am not only not the shortest serving prime minister in Canada, I'm not even the second shortest serving prime minister in Canada. I am, however, the third shortest serving prime minister in Canada. But what I find is that when people are, trolling me on X, now formerly Twitter or whatever they say, that's, she was prime minister for 10 minutes, and whatever, because I didn't belong. So you have to justify the fact that I lost the election because I didn't belong in the first place. But in fact, I did have 132 wonderful days, some of which were not in an election campaign, that I could do things. And I restructured the ministries of the government. I actually created the Department of Canadian Heritage. I created the freestanding Ministry of Health because I thought that was going to be very important. And I did a number of, created the Department of Public Safety. So I created a number of these things because I had committed to appointing a smaller cabinet, and you can't just sort of leave a few ministries unfilled to make your cabinet smaller. You do have to kind of reorganize things. But, you know, when I think of, you know, the things that I wanted to do and that I did, I take some pleasure in that. I take a great deal of pleasure in the reaction that I got from not just young women, but from women and men across the country who were deeply thrilled to have a woman prime minister. Now, sometimes they were just very competitive with the United States because they would say, you know, aha, we did it and you didn't. And sometimes little old men would come out. They go, oh, you're going to be our Maggie Thatcher. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, wonder what they're expecting. But anyway, but they were very happy. They were very happy. So to be the vehicle of that sense of change and possibility, I lost my luggage. I left my luggage. So I am demented. I actually left my suitcase in the customs office in the Montreal airport last year. I got it back. But while I was looking for it, a very nice security woman said to me, and when you became prime minister, my dad said to me, you see, you girls can do anything. So to make a long story short, people may have been pushing me under a bus. And there may have been a certain amount of poetic license when people discussed the possibility that we could even win that election, given that it was a 5-party race and the Reform Party and the Bloc Québécois had chomped away at our vote in the West and in Quebec. I did manage to hold sort of the hardcore Tory vote, but Lucien Bouchard ran off with our Quebec vote and Preston Manning ran off with our Western vote, notwithstanding that neither party could form a government. But, you know, nobody listens to me. Don't vote for them. They can't form a government. Well, we're going to vote for them anyway. So the point is that I don't, it was a very difficult situation. And my one fear was, if I run and I become leader and I fail, will that spoil it for everyone? And I don't think I'm flattering myself to say that it hasn't. I think people understood what a difficult challenge it was, but that they were nonetheless thrilled to see a woman doing that job. And I hope there will be someone who will do it more. So that's a long answer to your grandmother-in-law's short question, but really I don't feel like the throwee so much.
And I feel like, having spent the day with you, I knew that we would get this power that comes from you when you describe it and talk about it. When I was researching and looking back at that period of time as well, it was as though your predecessor, as well as you mentioned in your memoir, there was a hope that you would be able to run earlier, to have gotten leadership those few months earlier possibly, but that didn't end up happening. So in that period of time when you were running for leadership, when it was a lead up to the leadership convention, what was your inner dialogue around that? Did you see the writing on the wall? And even seeing the uphill battle, how did you choose to still run, still fight for leadership at that time?
Well, I think one of the things that you have to remember is that over half the caucus supported me. And I was very fastidious about never doing anything leadership-y while the prime minister was still there. And I remember going to represent the government when I was defense minister at a swearing in of a judge in Vancouver. And he was being sworn in, and the head of the Law Society kept referring to him as Chief Justice. And he said, no, I'm not Chief Justice, I'm just a judge. And he said, and I'm sure the Minister of Defense, which I was then at the time, will understand when I say, I do not wish to be seen as aspiring to a position in which there is at the moment no vacancy. So I did not aspire to the position while there was no vacancy, and was very careful about it. But once, you know, the Prime Minister announced he was stepping down, then a lot of people came forward, but a lot of caucus members supported me. And that also made me feel that I wanted to, I'm to tell you an interesting story, and I think I can name names, I don't think you would mind. You know, all big tent political parties have a broad variety of people in them. They're not ideologically homogeneous. And you have a certain center of gravity that maybe you agree with. It might be about the role of government in the economy or certain issues in foreign policy. There may be things that unite you, but there are other things that really divide you. And I'm very socially liberal. I'm from Vancouver Centre. I was a pro-choice, pro-gay rights, very socially liberal person. And then I was Minister of Justice. I did passed a lot of legislation that was probably quite liberal. And there were a lot of socially conservative people in my caucus. And one of the members, John Reimer, a very nice guy, actually he was very good. He chaired a special committee for me when I tabled my gun control legislation. I wanted to give the members a chance to take it home to their ridings and get feedback before we started second reading debate. So I moved the bill into a special committee, which the press all thought meant that I was trying to sabotage it. No, I was trying to guarantee that it would pass by giving my colleagues a chance to really think about it and talk to their constituents. And so John Reimer chaired that committee. And when the leadership contest started, and I was Minister of Defense, he came to see me and he said, Kim, if you become leader, he said, I'm chair of the Evangelical Caucus. I didn't even realize that, but he was a chair of the Evangelical Caucus. And he said to me, if you become leader, will you show us the same respect you did when you were Justice Minister? And I said, well, John, I'm the same person I ever was, and my door has always been open to you, and we're friends, and I'm very grateful for your help. And he said, because we would like to support you. And Don Blenkhorn, who made, Jurassic Park look, kind of mild. I mean, he was, not on, but he supported me. He said, I'm supporting Kim because she's tough, but she's fair. So I had support from some kind of people who weren't necessarily my soulmates, but who in the course of working with me, it had always been my modus operandi to respect people, to hear them. I would say, look, they're representing their constituents. They were elected on exactly the same basis I was. I can't, and they're my colleagues. So, and they would know that they weren't necessarily mainstream. They weren't going to necessarily win the argument. But if there was something I could massage that would give them something of a win, I would do it. And it just was really interesting to me. So with that kind of ambiance and reaction, I felt I wanted to run because I had that support. And, sadly, all these wonderful people who supported me also lost their seats. So I hope they've forgiven me. But so when you say, well, why do you run? The other thing, too, is you realize that there are things you could do as prime minister that you can't do as a minister. So you think, well, we're going into an election anyway. And, maybe I'll see if I can be in that position. And so, again, a long answer to a short question. I'm sorry.
We are here to hear it all. So I think we're all okay with these long answers. Something that also comes to mind is my mom often growing up, when I would have these, moments of just devastation, something happens at school, or I'm hearing the community, say something about me that felt untrue at the time, would always say, you know who you are. No one else can tell you who you are. And when I think of the scale at which a lot of this was coming at you in your prime ministership and after, how did you stay centered? What was that like for you to sort of be on the receiving end of that storm of incoming conversations, headlines, different things? And how did you reckon with that individually?
Well, sometimes it was hard. I didn't dwell on it. I didn't sort of bury myself in the news all the time in order to feel terrible. But there were some things. I mean, for example, the famous advertisements, which I never saw, and was told that they had actually been, not bothered a focus group of liberals, which is, you liberals are kind of sneaky. You probably went to the focus group and said, we're going to get these Tories to do these ads by pretending they're okay. Wouldn't surprise me at all, but it's okay. You can tell me later if that's what really happened. But the point is that there were things, but there were also things that were hard to predict. Because I was the first and no one who looked or sounded like me had done it before, I experienced what sexism really is. But again, I don't want to blame sexism because, I made lots of mistakes. It's very hard if you're the person to parse out what's sexism and what is just, incompetence or mistakes or putting your foot in it or what things that one is wont to do. But the one thing about any kind of bias or discrimination is that nobody says, I don't like women. They just don't give you the benefit of the doubt. So, Jean Chrétien would say, let me get elected and then ask me what I'm going to do. but if I didn't have kind of like a really elaborate plan that this Kim Campbell, she's got a hidden agenda. But because Jean Chrétien was seen to belong there, he'd been there a long time, and if he would put his foot in it, he'd say, "Oh, that's just Jean misspeaking," and the ideal thing is for women to get to the point where they are equally forgiven, where they are not held to that higher standard. But it's because people are uncomfortable. It's not that they don't want a woman to be there, but there's a visceral reaction. You're not like the others. So if they can find a reason to justify that discomfort, they will. And that's usually applying a double standard or not giving you the benefit of the doubt. But when you're the person who is the kind of the lab test of this theory, it can be kind of difficult and frustrating. I mean, that's more frustrating that people would put words in my mouth or misconstrue what I'd said. And as I say, I'd never get the benefit of the doubt. And I unfortunately have a rather highly developed sense of humor, which also wasn't always very helpful because not all members of our esteemed journalistic institutions share my sense of humor and appreciate irony. So that also got me into some trouble.
I think the levity also probably helps keep the spirits up for not just you, but your team.
I was laughing, but they were all writing, "Oh, she's unfit for performance."
They weren't in on the joke. When I think also of sort of where we are today, and we're seeing Jacinda Ardern step down at a very key time in her tenure, and also say it was for those personal reasons. You chaired the Council of Women World Leaders. I didn't even know this was a thing. There's this wonderful group of just all the women world leaders coming together all the time. I really just wish I could be a fly on the wall, but instead I will ask you questions because you are literally there. And my question would be, what is it like to be in the company of those women? And what lessons did it provide you or perspective on your time as Prime Minister when you got to commiserate with these other women who have fought their own battles in their own ways?
Well, all of their experiences are different. The founder was Vigdis Finnbogadóttir, who was the first woman to be democratically elected as a head of state in the world when she was elected president of Iceland. And, but she was very interesting because she was not married and she was a single mother, and her daughter was probably her daughter, but she went through some subterfuge to pretend that she had actually adopted this daughter. I mean, really kind of interesting when you think of, the shocking things. I mean, I once read an article about, what kind of a woman could be president of the United States, and they said not blonde. But so you can imagine being not married and having this daughter. But so at Iceland, I guess it's maybe a bit more tolerant, but she was much loved in Iceland. So she didn't have that. I think she maybe encountered things when she met perhaps with other people in other governments. But it varies enormously from country to country and culture to culture. But when we were all together, there was a great, a great camaraderie, in a sense that we'd all kind of been through the same thing. But some of them were the first in their country, and some of them were not. But I think once you have the position, in other words, if I had been elected, I think when you're functioning in the position, I mean, I functioned in it for 4 months, but if I had had a longer tenure, I think sometimes just the legitimacy of doing the job that you were elected to do can help to carry you through these things. And for some of these women, that was very clear. But they're all very different. And I think there's well over 60 members of the organization, and they are current and former women presidents and prime ministers. But we created the organization because, again, you thought I was a shorter serving prime minister. I forgive you, but I understand that. But a lot of people don't know that there are women who've been presidents and prime ministers. And I was at the International AIDS Conference, I think it was like 2004 or something. And I was on a panel with, I'll just drop a few names here, with Bill Clinton. Anyway, we had breakfast the next morning with Nelson Mandela, but another day, another breakfast with old Nell. Anyway, but I was introduced I was at that time chair of the Council of Women World Leaders, and I was introduced as the chair of this organization of former women leaders. And I said, well, actually, it's current and former leaders because, there aren't enough formers to fill a room up. So it's current and former leaders. And I said, and I will give $100 to anybody who at the end of the evening can give me there's 34 of us, anyone who can give me all the names. And Bill Clinton starts writing away. And I said, either you're highly competitive or they're not paying you a pension because of, but the next morning he said to me, Kim, I could only think of 17. He couldn't even think of all the women who were in office when he was president. So the reason we created this organization was to say women are doing this, and they are, doing it well, and some of them getting reelected. But if you think somebody doesn't belong, they just kind of fall off the radar screen. You don't think you have to remember them. And you might even be irritated if they insist on popping up. But it's quite interesting. So the Council of Women World Leaders, if you are surprised that there are that many living women who are or have been president or prime minister, and actually we've lost a few of them have died, so there have been actually more, then that's, what's the word I'm looking for? QED. I mean, that's the proof of the concept of the organization, which was to make these women visible. And there's a growing number now. You see, like the current president of Estonia, who's out there, really strong on Ukraine, and there are quite a number of women in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So it's becoming less unusual, but it needs to be part of our narrative. We have to not see it as an anomaly, not something, we can forget about them because it's a flash in the pan. No, they are the faces of a new political reality. And of course, it's helpful that in some of those countries, they have political systems where they have coalition governments. So often if a woman is leading a smaller party and the party is strong, she can lead a coalition government. So I think that sometimes makes it easier for women to rise to those leadership positions in those kinds of political systems.
Thank you for sharing that. And again, still want to be a fly on the wall. Just putting that out there. I want to invite
We
the
don't
audience.
really have flies on the wall, but you could come as an observer.
Oh, I love that. Same.
We're women. We don't.
Yes, actually, very, very clarifying point. We are going to take an audience question. So there is a mic here in the center. We have someone very eagerly joining us here. And we will take 2 audience questions. So if someone is interested in joining thereafter.
Actually, I think you have to turn it on. So,
There we go. I have the great pleasure of working with Kim Campbell, the Right Honourable, for your leadership campaign, even before that. And I just wanted to say, first of all, it was one of the honors of my life to do that. I also had great opportunity to work closely with you during this exact period you're talking about, when there was just inundation of attack points, media coverage, etc. But I always admired your cool under fire. I never heard you complain about it. I never heard you whine about it. I never heard you get angry about it. I think what struck me was she's so cool the way she's handling this. And that was not just my opinion, by the way. But I guess the question I have, you said something that, again, was a source of criticism. You said, I want to do politics differently. Now we've had 30 years later. And we see just incredible transformations, most of them negative, in the world of politics. Looking back on that, what were you really saying about that? What were you looking at in the world of politics and said, this needs change? What was it that you were focused on there? Because I think the world seems to say, I think they've kind of caught up with, yeah, we got to do this differently. I'm interested in your retrospective view of that.
Well, I think I wanted to try and do politics in a way that would make citizens feel good about their democratic community. When I was justice minister, for example, I consulted much more widely than had traditionally been the case. When I was doing my sexual assault bill, for example, we went to Toronto and we consulted with groups of women of color, people in the sex trade, a lot of people who had not been consulted, but whose perspective on the law of sexual assault was very interesting. And Anne McClellan, who was the second woman to be Minister of Justice, a lovely woman, became a good friend when I went to University of Alberta to create a leadership college. And she said that when she became minister, she was asked if she wanted to use the Campbell mode of consultation. And she said, what is that? And the people in the department said, well, it's a much broader, we cast the net much broader in terms of people that we talk to, not just the usual suspects, the Canadian Bar, the Law Societies, etc. And she did. And I think that was part of doing it differently. It was trying to put my head on other people's shoulders or put other people's heads on my shoulders to understand how things looked to people who weren't on the inside and how you could build trust. And again, it was like my work with the members of caucus who didn't share my views, but it was, it was very, I often will say when I was running the leadership college and I talk to young people, I'd say the most valuable currency you will ever spend is respect. That's the most important thing. If people feel respected, then there's a basis for communication. And I just felt that a lot of people felt alienated from government. If you remember what the issues were in that time, there was a lot of regional alienation, et cetera. And I felt it was something that how you operated in government and how you treated people and how you communicated, that it could be different. Now, I might have been naive. I might well have found that, that and $3 would have bought me a latte, that I wasn't going to succeed. But certainly when I dealt with a lot of very difficult issues as justice minister, I got some very difficult legislation through, like my big gun control bill. Incidentally, talking about people who don't expect that you as a woman you can succeed. So I have this big gun control bill, which was an excellent piece of legislation. If anybody wants to sit in a corner for 4 hours and hear me tell you about what a good piece. But when it passed, the press could not figure out how it passed because I was Kim Campbell. So they would say, how did it get through that? Well, Mulrooney must have pulled her irons out of the fire. And those of us who work with Brian Mulrooney know that he never pulled anybody's irons out of the fire. If you couldn't pull your own irons out of the fire, so there was somebody else who would do your job. Yeah. But it was that because they didn't see what I did to build the support for it. And how carefully I did that, because it's a very controversial issue. So the fact that I didn't, go out and meet the press and go, we're going to get this through and I'm going to have my bill. I never did that, because if I did that, I wouldn't have had a bill. Yeah. So I think that was sort of what I was thinking of, is how can I also produced a document. And incidentally, that was the other thing. I produced a document called Doing Politics Differently during the leadership. And I talked about using backbenchers in a different way, because I knew that many of them, they weren't in cabinet often just the luck of the draw. I got to be in cabinet because I was elected in '88, and 2 of the sitting cabinet ministers from BC weren't returned. Pat Carney resigned, and Jerry St. Germain was defeated. So in theory, there were 2 vacancies in British Columbia, because we tried to have a regionally balanced caucus, and Brian Mulrooney could appoint 2 ministers from British Columbia, and I was one of them. But if I'd been from Alberta, where there were 3 senior ministers, all of whom were returned, and a caucus full of bright and able young whippersnappers, but those bright and able young whippersnappers didn't get to be in cabinet because the Don Mazinkowski, Harvey Andre, and third person, I'll think in a minute, were there, didn't go. So it was I was trying to find ways where backbenchers could have more visible say, because they often fought you tooth and nail while you were trying to do your legislation, but their constituents didn't know that, because they were expected in public to be supportive. So I produced this document that talked a lot about differences in how I wanted to use prime ministerial power. And I remember then doing a press conference after we, issued the document, and the reporter saying, yeah, but what do you really stand for? And I just thought, shoot me,
I don't know if your gun control bill would have loved that comeback.
Well, shoot me with a non-semi-automatic.
Love that. A Nerf gun, gun.
With only 3 bullets in your magazine. Thank you.
I actually I noticed a student actually get up in the back, and because this is on campus, I feel like we must hear from a student, and your passion was oozing. So please come and ask your question. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much for noticing. Hello, thank you to you both so much for this conversation, and to all the organizers. My name is Delphine. I'm a student here on campus. this is a little low for me.
You can pull it right out
I'm
if you'd
tall.
like.
Thank you so much. So I was just, I heard you say something that was to the effect of, if I fail, will I spoil it for everyone else? And I was wondering if you could speak a little more to that distinct experience of being a woman, to be the first to do something, to be the first to hold a role, to have a position or an opportunity. As much as it's an incredible privilege and a source of pride, it's also terrifying to feel like you're not only representing yourself, but like all women on campus or all women in Canada, and that you're becoming the face of that. And so I was just wondering if you had some advice to offer for, women who feel that burden, but also opportunity to be a representative for other women around them. Thank you so
just
much.
have to do it. I remember years ago when Indira Gandhi sent the Indian Army into the Golden Temple in Amritsar, and I'm listening to the radio in Vancouver. We have a big South Asian community in Vancouver, and a man is being interviewed, and he's saying, and I always believed in women in politics till Mrs. Gandhi. And I thought, and I always believed in men in politics till Stalin and Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan and Adolf Hitler. They don't say, it's that way. So, but that's why, again, I think you just have to do it. And all of the rest of us have to not stand for that kind of rhetoric. I may be a turkey, but I'm not a turkey who discredits every other woman who might aspire to political office. You cannot like me, but it's my gender, is not, determinative, and other people of my gender might in fact do extremely well. And that's why the narratives, when we create the understanding that in general, the world is full of brilliant women, and history has been made by brilliant women. And not every woman will succeed. And you might not like her because you don't like her party, or you might not agree with something she says. But in the context of a group of people, of half of the human race, who have proven their capacity to be amazing, this one person, if she fails because she failed, not women failed. And we, by the narratives that we tell and that we insist on, can help to protect people from that. However
Thank you so
feel
much.
about Indira Gandhi.
Thank you. Community and the people we surround ourselves with sound like a key determinant of this, of us succeeding and thriving and feeling supported and feeling like we can do those hard things and pick ourselves up off the ground when we hit our knees in those very difficult moments. As we come to a close, I have endless questions. Didn't even make it through half of them, but here we are. We'll keep asking later. But there's a story that you shared that really, really stuck with me when I was doing my research. And it was a conversation with a former French teacher that you had.
Yeah, I told this story in the wonderful Daughters of the Vote the first time. That's a wonderful program where young women compete to be recognized in their constituencies, and they come to Ottawa, and then the first one was when we were still in the old Parliament building, and it was quite miraculous to see every seat filled by a young woman. And so I told them that when I was Prime Minister, my French teacher, Pierre Boschman, was very, very adamant that I should be Madame la Première Ministre, not le Premier Ministre, because it's often in French, the women use the male titles, although it's changing. So he persuaded me that I should be La Première Ministre, the feminine form. So I had stationery printed, lovely stationery that said the Prime Minister, La Première Ministre. And as I explained to the young women sitting in Parliament, I wasn't there long enough to use it all. And knowing the waste not, want not philosophy of the Government of Canada, and that might be the funniest thing I've said all evening, but that I was convinced that somewhere over in the Langevin block, there was some old cupboard with some boxes of old stationery that said, La Première Ministre. And I hope that one of them would one day use it.
As we come to a close, thank you all for coming today. Is there any last thing you'd like to say to everyone in this room as we go forth towards those big, audacious dreams that we are all chasing? Some in line of your political aspirations and many, many others. I can see those dreams in this room. What would you want to say to all of us?
Well, first of all, this room is full of people that I know and who have been part of my life and whom I admire immensely because I know what their accomplishments are. And many people I don't know whom I would admire immensely if I knew what their accomplishments were, because I know that they are many. But we're all sitting here because we all think democracy is important. And you know, it is. I live in Italy now. And recently I went with my sister to Ravenna to put flowers on the grave of my father's best friend who was killed there during the war. My dad was with the Canadian Army in Italy, but was wounded, but happily survived. Otherwise, my sister would have been an only child. And she'd be sitting here, who knows? But the point is, when you know what the price has been paid to push back against authoritarianism and fascism and to enable even Italy to have democratic institutions, loony as they are. But anyway, just kidding. They're very nice. They're just very Italian. And but the point is, you know, both my parents were in uniform in World War II. And I think my interest in politics grew from my desire to make a difference. And we weren't at war. So, you know, I didn't have to join the Navy like my mother. So we all share that. We know that for all of its faults and all the worries we have about the effects of polarization and dysfunctionality that can happen in government, at the end of the day, there's nothing you can do that's more important than make democracies work. And, you know, it's been said a million times, and Churchill was right, it's the worst form of government except for all the others, but it is so precious. And so I am so delighted to be here in the company of this group of people. All of you are tiles in the mosaic of progress. You're all the good guys who understand what's important. And we're in our national capital, which has been for me the scene of great triumphs and, you know, many tears. But most importantly, it represents our hope for the rule of law, which is the most important part of democracy, and democratic institutions to function. So thank you for caring enough to come out and for being an ongoing part of the most important thing we can say about our country, and that is that it's a democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Right Honourable Kim Campbell.
I'd now like to invite our next speaker, who represents the next generation of female leaders. Madison Pearson works on Parliament Hill as an MP's assistant, and she is also a current Famous 5 Ottawa mentee. The Famous 5 Ottawa mentorship program gives young women the opportunity to gain experience in public speaking and media. To tell us more about this program, please welcome Madison Pearson.
Hi, everyone. So as I was introduced, my name is Madison, and pardon? Move the mic up. Thank you, Ms. Campbell. Something I didn't think that I'd really say ever in my life, but here we go. So yes, I am the Famous 5 Ottawa mentee right now, and I'm just up here very briefly to thank the Right Honourable Kim Campbell for speaking with us all today, and for that. As a Western woman from Alberta, it is so refreshing in Ottawa to have that Western honesty and grit and to have the courage to change the narrative. So thank you very much for that. Very briefly, I'd like to discuss the mentee program. I'd like to thank the sponsor of Famous 5 Ottawa's mentee program, which is Uniglobe CBO Travel. The president being Salma Siddiqui, and I'd like to thank them very much for, allowing me to be here today. Finally, I would actually have a couple of gifts for Ms. Campbell to show our appreciation on behalf of everyone here today, but also on behalf of the Women's History Project and their partners, on behalf of the University of Ottawa, on behalf of Famous 5 Ottawa and of the Famous 5 Foundation. So I've been told we have some small gifts for you here. Small tokens of our appreciation. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone here when I say that I want to be Kim Campbell when I grow up. So I know we're all excited to do a little bit of mingling, so I will pass it back to our lovely MC. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Madison. I know we're a little bit over time, so we're just going to keep moving through. And to close the event, I invite once again, President and co-founder of the Women's History Project, Deborah Davis.
Just before I just end, just want to let you know that Marlene Catterall has arrived and we're just delighted. And Marlene, there you are. Congratulations on your award today. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Beatrice mentioned you a little bit earlier, and I'm delighted that you were able to make it. Before we end tonight, I'd like to pay tribute to Monique Bégin, dear friend and neighbor. Several of our close friends are here with us tonight, and what a woman. I was a young staffer when Monique was the Minister of Health and Welfare. We met in the early 90s. When I went to the High Commission in London, I invited Monique and her close friend Judy Rolla to chair a conference for me at the Canada House. And to my delight, when I moved back to Ottawa in 2016, I moved into the same apartment building as Monique. And throughout the COVID pandemic, we were part of the same bubble in our building. There must have been like 400 people in our building. That was our bubble. We had a great many conversations, and she was always interested in the work, setting up the Women's History Project and the work, my work at Women and Gender Equality. Her contributions to women's equality were significant. She was a founding member of the Fédération des Femmes de Québec in the 1960s, Secretary General of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, as Minister and post-politics as a joint chair of gender studies at the University of Ottawa and Carleton University, and then Dean of Health Sciences. Tonight, I'm delighted to announce that the Women's History Project will host the annual Monique Bégin Lecture to continue the power of women's voices in public life, a peripatetic event working with academic partners. We want to remember Monique and to continue to profile the many women in public life, such as Monique, who made a difference. Finally, I would like to thank the Right Honourable Kim Campbell for her amazing contribution to today. We did a video podcast earlier and to tonight. And I think what I take away is the sense of humor and love you have for your work and your life, and how inspirational that is. If we can't laugh about some of these things that we have to go through, then how can we go through them? So I would like to thank you. I would like to thank the sponsors again, the University of Ottawa, Famous 5 Foundation, Famous 5 Ottawa. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, Kriya, who has helped us, and I thank Vivian Poy and Nancy's very own All Saints, whose venue we use this afternoon. If you would like to support our work, please let us know. Check us out at www.womenshistoryproject.ca. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Good night.
Thank you very much for being here tonight and for supporting women's history. Merci de votre présence ce soir et merci d'appuyer l'histoire des femmes. J'espère que vous aurez la chance de poursuivre la discussion pendant la période de réseautage. I'm sure you'll have a great deal to talk about. Have a very great evening, everyone. Merci tout le monde.